The mower was still running when my daughter asked the question that changed everything I thought I knew about the woman next door. She was standing beside the wooden fence, one small hand wrapped around the picket, staring at our neighbor across the yard with the kind of innocent curiosity only a child could have. Then she looked up at me and asked why Mrs. Corinne Whitmore always stopped what she was doing whenever I mowed the lawn. I almost laughed, because I had noticed it too, but I had always assumed it was nothing. Instead, Corinne went completely still. The smile disappeared from her face, her fingers tightened around the mug she was holding, and for several seconds she looked at me as if she had suddenly been transported to a place neither my daughter nor I could see. If you believe that kindness can reach people when words cannot, that forgiveness can heal wounds we cannot see, and that everyone deserves hope and a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who may need it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing stories of compassion, courage, and unexpected human connection to our community. My name is Grant Mercer, and at the time this happened, I had been living in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, with my 9-year-old daughter, Elsie. Our house was modest, our backyard was small, and most weekends were filled with ordinary things that somehow felt important when you were raising a child alone. Elsie had a habit of turning every chore into an adventure. Washing the car became a race against imaginary storms. Grocery shopping became a hunt for the brightest cereal box. Even mowing the lawn became something she considered entertaining because she liked riding her little scooter along the sidewalk while I pushed the mower back and forth. Our next-door neighbor, Corinne Whitmore, had lived in the house beside ours for nearly 15 years. She was a quiet woman in her late 40s with pale blonde hair usually tied loosely behind her head, a careful garden, and a habit of sitting outside with a cup of tea whenever the weather was warm. She was polite but distant. We exchanged greetings, returned packages when one of us was away, and occasionally talked about the weather, but there was always a strange invisible wall between us. I had never understood it. Corinne was never rude, but whenever I tried to make more than casual conversation, she seemed uncomfortable and found a reason to go inside. The oddest thing was what happened every time I mowed the lawn. The moment the mower started, Corinne would appear somewhere in her backyard. Sometimes she would sit beneath the maple tree with her tea. Sometimes she would stand near the fence, pretending to trim flowers. Once, I even noticed her sitting on her patio steps, watching silently until I finished. At first, I assumed she simply liked the sound of lawn equipment. Then I wondered whether my mower was too loud. I apologized once, telling her I could try to mow earlier or later, but she had quickly shaken her head and smiled as if I had misunderstood something. I eventually stopped thinking about it. My life was busy enough. I was working long hours at a small construction supply company, trying to keep up with bills, school forms, grocery shopping, laundry, and the endless responsibilities that came with being both a father and a mother in Elsie's world. Her mother, my former wife, had moved to another state 3 years earlier and rarely called. I never spoke badly about her in front of Elsie, even when the silence hurt. I wanted my daughter to grow up believing that people could make mistakes without becoming monsters. That Saturday afternoon, the sun was bright but gentle, and I decided to mow the lawn before Elsie's soccer practice. I had barely started when I saw Corinne step outside. She was holding her usual white mug. Elsie noticed her almost immediately. She leaned against the fence and watched Corinne watching me. Then, with the blunt honesty of a child who had not yet learned how complicated adults could be, she asked why Corinne always watched her dad mow the lawn. The question was innocent, but its effect was anything but. Corinne's face changed so quickly that I stopped pushing the mower. She looked at Elsie, then at me, and finally down at the mug in her hands. For a moment nobody moved. Even Elsie seemed to sense that she had accidentally opened a door that was never supposed to be opened. Corinne slowly walked toward the fence. She looked older than she had a moment before, as if a decade of memories had suddenly settled across her face. She told Elsie that she watched because the sound of the mower reminded her of someone she had loved very much. Elsie immediately asked who, and Corinne glanced at me before answering that it was her son. My hands tightened around the mower handle. I had never known Corinne had a son. She had never mentioned a child, never displayed photographs in her yard, and never spoke about family. I asked her gently if he lived nearby. She shook her head. He had died when he was 19. The mower engine had gone quiet, but I could still hear its faint ticking as it cooled. Corinne told us that her son, Nolan, used to mow the lawn every Saturday. He had been the kind of boy who hated doing chores but somehow made everyone laugh while doing them. He would put on old headphones, push the mower around the yard, and stop every few minutes to talk to his mother through the kitchen window. She said she had complained about the noise more than once because she was working from home and found it distracting. Then, one afternoon, Nolan had gone out to mow the lawn and never came back. He had been killed in a traffic accident while driving to pick up a replacement mower part. Corinne had been waiting for him to return. She had been angry about the unfinished grass. She had even written a note on the kitchen counter telling him to finish it before lunch. Her voice trembled when she explained that the note was still there in her memory, even though the paper itself had disappeared years ago. She had spent years wishing she could erase the last ordinary thought she had about her son. She didn't want the last thing she remembered to be a complaint about grass. She wanted to remember him laughing, but grief had a strange way of attaching itself to ordinary sounds. A lawn mower starting in the afternoon could take her straight back to the day when everything changed. That was why she watched me. Not because she was curious about me. Not because she was judging my yard. She watched because, for a few minutes every Saturday, the sound made her feel as though someone she loved was still alive. Elsie was silent. I expected her to become frightened or uncomfortable, but instead she slipped her hand through the fence and reached for Corinne's fingers. It was such a small gesture that I almost missed it. Corinne looked down at their hands and began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet tears of someone who had been carrying too much for too long. I turned away for a moment because I suddenly felt ashamed. I had spent years assuming her behavior was strange. I had wondered whether she disliked me. I had even told myself that maybe she was overly curious about our family. Never once had I considered that she might be grieving. That afternoon, Corinne invited us into her backyard. She showed Elsie a small garden she had planted in Nolan's memory. There were blue flowers along the edge because blue had been his favorite color. She told us that she had stopped celebrating his birthday because the date became too painful. She had stopped opening the box containing his childhood things. She had stopped talking about him because people eventually became uncomfortable when grief lasted too long. The world expected people to mourn, then move forward. But Corinne had discovered that moving forward did not mean leaving someone behind. Sometimes it meant learning how to carry their memory without allowing it to destroy you. I listened as she spoke, and something inside me began to shift. I thought about Elsie's mother. I thought about the anger I had carried for years, the arguments I replayed in my head, and all the moments when I had wanted someone to blame because blame felt easier than accepting that some wounds had no clean explanation. I realized that grief and resentment had something in common. Both could become heavy enough that you forgot you were carrying them. Before we left, Elsie asked whether Corinne would like to watch me finish mowing the lawn. Corinne smiled through her tears and said she would. So I started the mower again. This time, instead of staying behind the window or pretending to work in the garden, Corinne sat openly beside the fence. Elsie sat next to her, swinging her legs and telling her stories about school. Every few minutes, I glanced over and saw them together. Corinne was smiling. It wasn't the distant polite smile I had seen for years. It was warm and genuine, almost relieved. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Corinne became part of our ordinary life. She helped Elsie plant tomatoes. Elsie began bringing her drawings across the fence. I repaired a loose section of Corinne's garden gate. She brought us muffins on Sunday mornings. None of us ever tried to force the relationship. It simply grew, the way healthy things often do when given patience and sunlight. Then one afternoon, Corinne handed me a small wooden box. Inside was an old photograph of Nolan standing beside the same lawn mower he had used as a teenager. He was laughing, covered in grass, holding a garden hose like a weapon. Corinne told me she had kept the photograph hidden for years because looking at it hurt too much. But she no longer wanted to hide it. She wanted someone else to know that Nolan had existed, that he had been funny and stubborn and loved, and that his life had mattered. I told her that Elsie already knew something about him. She knew that a boy named Nolan had once made his mother laugh and that his memory had somehow become part of our family without anyone planning it. Corinne cried again, but this time she laughed too. Months passed, and our neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Yet every Saturday, when I started the mower, Corinne still came outside. The difference was that she no longer watched from a distance. She would sit with Elsie, sometimes holding a cup of tea, sometimes helping her with a book, sometimes simply enjoying the afternoon. One day Elsie asked her if she still missed Nolan. Corinne looked toward me before answering that she probably always would. Then she explained that missing someone did not mean you had to spend the rest of your life standing still. Those words stayed with me. I realized that day that some people don't need us to fix their pain. They need us to stop being afraid of it. They need someone willing to sit beside them without rushing them toward happiness. They need a fence crossed, a hand offered, a lawn finished, a memory spoken aloud. Years later, Elsie still remembered the afternoon she asked why our neighbor watched me mow the lawn. She said she had thought it was a strange question at the time, but eventually understood that it had opened the door to a friendship none of us knew we needed. Corinne became the grandmother Elsie never had nearby. She came to school events, birthdays, soccer games, and family lunches. And every Saturday afternoon, no matter how busy life became, I still mowed the lawn. Sometimes Corinne would close her eyes when the mower started. Sometimes she would smile. And sometimes, when the sunlight fell across her garden, I could almost believe that the sound no longer reminded her only of the worst day of her life. Maybe it reminded her that love could survive loss. Maybe it reminded her that memories did not have to remain painful forever. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to leave a meaningful comment and tell us what you believe the lesson is. Would you have reached across that fence, or would you have been too afraid of someone else's pain? Share your thoughts with our community, because sometimes one honest comment can remind another person that they are not alone. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the people we think are watching us are actually remembering someone they lost. Sometimes the strange behavior we judge is simply grief wearing a different face. And sometimes, without realizing it, we become part of another person's healing simply by continuing to live our ordinary lives with kindness. Corinne never stopped missing Nolan. None of us expected her to. But she eventually learned that loving someone who was gone did not mean refusing to love the people who were still here. And I learned something too. Forgiveness is not always about forgiving another person. Sometimes it is about forgiving yourself for surviving, for moving forward, for laughing again, and for discovering that happiness can return without betraying the people you have lost. The last time I saw Corinne watching me mow, Elsie was beside her, laughing about something at the fence. Corinne looked at me and smiled. I smiled back. There was no sadness in that moment, only recognition. We both understood what the sound meant now. It meant someone had been loved. It meant someone was remembered. And most importantly, it meant that life was still moving forward. For a long time, I thought the story had ended that Saturday afternoon when Corinne finally told us about Nolan. I believed that understanding the reason behind her strange habit was enough. I was wrong. Sometimes the truth does not close a story, it opens another door, one that leads deeper into places people have spent years trying to keep locked. That door opened for me on a warm Tuesday afternoon when I came home early from work and found Corinne sitting on the front steps of our house with Elsie beside her. My daughter was holding a small envelope, and the expression on her face told me immediately that something serious had happened. Corinne looked at me with an uncertainty I had never seen in her before. She told me that Elsie had found something in the garden while helping her pull weeds, and she had been too nervous to look at it alone. I asked what it was, and Elsie handed me the envelope. My name was written across the front in handwriting I did not recognize. I opened it carefully. Inside was a faded photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph showed Nolan as a teenager standing beside his mother in front of Corinne's house. What shocked me was the background. Behind them stood a younger version of the same wooden fence that separated our yards. I stared at it for several seconds before realizing that our two houses had once belonged to the same property. Corinne explained that when she and her husband bought the house years ago, the neighboring property had been part of their land. After Nolan died, Corinne's husband could no longer bear living there. They separated not long afterward, and eventually the property was divided and sold. Our house had been built on the section where Nolan had once spent his childhood summers. That discovery changed the way I saw our backyard. The lawn I had considered nothing more than grass had once been part of Nolan's world. The tree where Elsie liked to sit had been planted when he was a boy. The narrow strip of garden beside our fence had once been where he learned to ride a bicycle. Corinne had been watching me mow because, without knowing it, I was bringing movement back to a place that had become frozen in her memory. But there was something else in the envelope. The note was written by Nolan. It was not a final letter or anything tragic. It was something far more ordinary. A teenage boy had written it to his future self as part of a school assignment. He had written about the kind of man he hoped to become. He wanted to own a small house, have a family, teach his children how to fix things, and grow tomatoes in the backyard. He had written that he hoped his mother would live close enough to visit whenever she wanted. At the bottom of the page, he had drawn a terrible little picture of a house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. Corinne had never seen the note before. She explained that she had found it beneath a loose section of the old garden shed years after Nolan died, but she could never bring herself to open it. She had kept it inside the envelope and eventually forgotten where she had placed it. Elsie had discovered it while cleaning the old wooden storage box in Corinne's garden. I looked at Corinne and realized why she had been so shaken. Nolan had dreamed of becoming the kind of man I was trying to be for Elsie. He had wanted a home, a family, and a garden. And without knowing it, I had been living the ordinary life he never got the chance to experience. Corinne told me she had always wondered what Nolan would have become. She had spent years imagining different versions of his life. Sometimes she imagined him married. Sometimes she imagined him with children. Sometimes she imagined him sitting in the backyard complaining about mowing the grass. She laughed softly when she admitted that she could almost picture him arguing with his own children about chores. Then she looked at Elsie. For the first time, she told us that she had been afraid to become attached to anyone again. That confession explained everything. After losing Nolan, Corinne had slowly pushed people away. Friends stopped visiting because she stopped answering invitations. Her marriage collapsed under the weight of grief neither she nor her husband knew how to carry. She had convinced herself that distance was safer. If she never became close to anyone, she could never lose anyone again. But Elsie had ignored that wall. Children often do. They simply walk through doors adults spend years building. Elsie asked Corinne whether she thought Nolan would have liked her. Corinne smiled and said she was certain he would have. Elsie then asked something that made all 3 of us silent. She asked whether Corinne wanted to be part of our family. Corinne covered her face with one hand. I could see her fighting back tears. She told Elsie that she would be honored. From that day forward, things changed again. Corinne stopped calling herself our neighbor. Elsie started calling her Aunt Corinne, even though they were not related. At first I thought the name was simply a child's invention, but eventually it became natural. Corinne attended school events and brought Elsie small gardening books. She taught her how to recognize flowers and how to save seeds for the following spring. In return, Elsie taught Corinne how to use video calls and helped her organize old photographs on her computer. One afternoon, while we were sitting together in the backyard, Corinne asked me whether I had ever forgiven Elsie's mother. The question caught me off guard. I admitted that I wasn't sure. Corinne told me that she had spent years believing forgiveness meant saying that something hadn't hurt. Eventually she realized forgiveness meant admitting that something had hurt terribly and still choosing not to let that pain control the rest of your life. I knew she wasn't only talking about my former marriage. She was talking about herself. She had been angry at herself for Nolan's death because she had complained about the lawn that morning. She had been angry at her husband for not knowing how to save their marriage. She had been angry at herself for surviving when her son didn't. She had even been angry at Nolan for leaving the house that afternoon, even though she knew logically that none of it had been his fault. Grief had given her 1,000 places to put blame. She was finally ready to put it down. A few weeks later, I helped Corinne clean out the old shed. We found boxes of Nolan's childhood things: baseball cards, school notebooks, a broken bicycle bell, a wooden airplane, and an old pair of work gloves. Corinne wanted to throw everything away at first. Then she stopped and asked Elsie what she thought. Elsie chose 3 things to keep: the wooden airplane, the photograph, and Nolan's old gardening gloves. She told Corinne that memories didn't have to fill an entire room to matter. That sentence stayed with Corinne. We created a small garden corner near the fence and placed the wooden airplane beneath a flowering plant. It became a quiet memorial, but it didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a celebration. Corinne planted blue flowers around it. Elsie placed a small painted stone beside them. I repaired the fence so that the garden could be seen from both yards. The first time the flowers bloomed, Corinne stood there for several minutes without speaking. Then she smiled. Not because she had forgotten Nolan. Because she had finally stopped being afraid to remember him. One Saturday afternoon, I started mowing the lawn as usual. Elsie was sitting on the fence with a book. Corinne was working in the flower bed. When the mower started, she looked up. For a moment, I wondered if the old sadness would return. Instead, she laughed. She walked toward the fence and told me that Nolan used to hate mowing around flower beds because he always accidentally crushed at least one plant. I laughed too. Elsie looked at Corinne and asked whether Nolan had been good at gardening. Corinne shook her head and smiled. She said he was terrible. And for the first time, she told the story without crying. That was when I understood what healing really looked like. It wasn't forgetting. It wasn't replacing Nolan. It wasn't pretending the loss had never happened. Healing was being able to tell a story about someone you loved and smile at the memory before the tears arrived. As the years passed, the little garden became one of the most beautiful places in our neighborhood. People walking past would stop to admire the flowers. Corinne eventually began volunteering at a local community garden, something she had never considered before. She started helping other widows and grieving parents who were struggling to reconnect with ordinary life. She told them that grief could make the world feel smaller, but kindness could slowly make it larger again. And Elsie grew up watching all of it. She learned that people could carry invisible wounds. She learned not to judge someone simply because they behaved differently. She learned that sometimes the person who seems distant is actually waiting for someone to make them feel safe. Most importantly, she learned that kindness does not always require grand gestures. Sometimes kindness is simply noticing. Years after that first question, Elsie was old enough to understand exactly what she had accidentally uncovered. One afternoon, she stood beside the same fence and watched me mow the lawn. She smiled and told me that she still remembered asking Corinne why she watched me. I asked whether she regretted asking. She shook her head. She said that if she hadn't asked, we might never have known Nolan's story. She might never have become close to Corinne. And Corinne might have spent many more years believing she had to carry her grief alone. I looked across the fence at the garden. The blue flowers were moving gently in the afternoon breeze. For years, I had believed the mower was simply a machine that cut grass. Now I understood that, to Corinne, it had become a bridge between the past and the present. It carried the memory of a boy she had lost into the life of a family she had never expected to find. And somehow, without planning it, Elsie and I had become part of the answer to a prayer Corinne had stopped believing would ever be heard. If this story touched your heart, leave a meaningful comment and tell us what you would do if you discovered that someone you judged was secretly carrying a pain you knew nothing about. Would you reach out? Would you forgive? Would you give that person another chance? Your words may be exactly what someone in our community needs to hear today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the person standing quietly on the other side of the fence isn't watching your life out of curiosity. Sometimes they're watching because your ordinary life reminds them of the life they lost. And sometimes the smallest question, asked by the most innocent person, can open a door that grief kept locked for years. Elsie asked why Corinne watched me mow the lawn. Corinne's answer made us freeze. But what happened afterward taught us something neither of us would ever forget. People don't always need us to save them. Sometimes they only need us to notice them. Sometimes they need us to stay. And sometimes, when we choose kindness instead of judgment, we don't just change someone else's life. We change our own.